The man's hand closed around her wrist before she could reach the elevator button. Not a warning touch, not a mistake, a grip. Tight enough to stop her, tight enough to leave a mark. The concrete garage swallowed the sound of her breath as it hitched in her throat, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like they always did, indifferent cold. Someone nearby laughed. Not loud, just enough to say this wasn't an accident. "Don't walk away from me," the man said. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never been questioned in this building. "You think you can just wander around here?" She didn't pull back. She didn't raise her voice. She looked down at his hand, then up at his face. Late 60s, ruddy skin, baseball cap from a local contractors association, the kind of man who shook hands with sheriffs at charity breakfasts and called them by their first names. "I'm going to the elevator," she said. Calm. Flat. "You're in my way." That was when his wife stepped closer. She was a few feet back, clutching a leather purse against her chest like a shield. Silver hair set perfectly. Pearl studs. The practiced expression of concern that came easily to women who had learned how to weaponize it. She scanned the garage as if looking for witnesses, then fixed her eyes on the black woman standing too still, too composed, too out of place for their comfort. "Frank," she said softly, but not gently. She's not listening. The word she meant was something else. Frank tightened his grip. "This is county property," he said. "Employees, lawyers, people with business. You don't look like any of those." There it was, simple, clean, said without shame. The woman did not answer right away. Her breathing slowed. In. Out. She had learned long ago that silence unsettled people like him more than arguments ever could. She shifted her weight, feeling the ache in her left knee she always felt in the mornings, the one that flared when rain was coming. She could smell motor oil, old concrete stale coffee, from a paper cup dropped near a pillar. "My business," she said. "Finally. Doesn't require your approval." Frank laughed. Sharp. Disbelieving. "You got some nerve." Behind him, his wife was already dialing. Her thumb moved fast, practiced. This was not her first call like this. 911, she said into the phone before the dispatcher had finished speaking. "We're in the county courthouse garage, level 2. There's a woman here causing a disturbance." The woman heard herself being described without being named. Suspicious, aggressive, refusing to comply. Words stacked awfully, each one chosen to tilt the ground beneath her feet. She did not interrupt. She did not protest. She had learned the cost of doing that, too. A security cart rolled past the end of the aisle, tires squealing briefly before fading. The elevator chimed somewhere behind her doors, opening for no one. She felt Frank's thumb press into the soft skin above her wrist, just enough to remind her who he thought was in control. "Let go," she said. "Not until someone gets here," he replied. "You don't belong." Belong. The word landed heavier than the grip. It always did. Minutes later, the cart returned slower this time. A man stepped off. Grey uniform, radio clipped to his shoulder. Name patch that read, Hayes. He took in the scene in a single glance, and his body language shifted before anyone spoke. Shoulders squared, chin lifted. He walked past Frank and his wife without question, and stopped in front of the woman. "Ma'am," he said, already tired. "What seems to be the problem?" Frank released her wrist like it had burned him. "She's been wandering around," he said quickly. We felt threatened. His wife nodded hard, phone still at her ear. She wouldn't explain why she was here. Hayes looked at the woman, took in her sensible shoes, her plain coat. The canvas bag at her side scuffed at the corners, heavy with something that pulled her shoulder slightly forward. He did not ask if she was hurt. He did not ask her name. "This is a secure area," he said. "I'm going to need you to step aside while I sort this out." She felt it then, the familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear. Something older. Something that had shaped her posture, her tone, her restraint over decades. She glanced down at her wrist. A faint red mark was already forming. "I was assaulted," she said. Still calm, still measured. "I want to make a report." Hayes hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Then he exhaled through his nose. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." Frank smiled. Relief flashed across his face like sunlight breaking through cloud. His wife lowered her phone, satisfied. The woman studied Hayes's eyes, saw the calculation there, the quiet decision. This would be handled, logged, filed away, forgotten. She bent down and picked up her bag, the weight familiar grounding, straightened her coat. Her wrist throbbed now, a dull, insistent ache. She looked past Hayes, past Frank and his wife, toward the elevator. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I have court." Hayes frowned. "Excuse me," I said. She repeated, "I have court." The words hung there, heavier now. Frank's smile faltered. His wife shifted her purse. Hayes opened his mouth, then stopped. He glanced at the bag again, at the way she stood, not defiant, not pleading, simply immovable. "You're a defendant?" he asked. "No." A witness, no. She reached into her bag then. Slowly. Not for a badge, not for identification. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, edges worn from use, and held it at her side, not offering it yet. Frank scoffed. "This is ridiculous." The elevator chimed again. This time, footsteps followed. Voices. Laughter. Two young attorneys walked out, briefcases, swinging conversation dying as they took in the scene. One of them looked at the woman, then at Hayes, then back at the woman again. His brow furrowed. "Oh," he said quietly. Hayes turned. "You know her?" The young man swallowed. "That's Judge Brooks." Silence hit the garage like a dropped weight. Frank's face drained of color. His wife's mouth opened, then closed. She laughed once, a short, broken sound. "That's not funny." The woman met Hayes's eyes now. Really met them. "Eleanor Brooks," she said. "County Court." Hayes stepped back as if the ground had shifted under his feet. "Judge," he stammered. "I didn't realize." "I know," she replied. Frank found his voice again. Brittle. "You didn't say anything." "I wasn't asked," Eleanor said. The moment stretched. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere above them, a courtroom waited, empty, silent, prepared. Eleanor felt the weight of it, then not as power, but as responsibility. This was not over. It was only beginning. She turned toward the elevator. This time, no one stopped her. As the doors closed, Frank's wife whispered, "Frank?" He didn't answer. He was staring at the closed metal doors, at his reflection, warped across their surface, at the shape of a mistake that had just grown larger than either of them understood. Upstairs, Eleanor would put on her robe. She would take her seat. She would look out over a room full of people who believed the system was solid, predictable, fair. In the garage below, the red mark on her wrist darkened slowly, steadily, as if the truth itself were rising to the surface. The courtroom smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper, a scent Eleanor Brooks associated with routine, with order, with things happening the way they were supposed to. She took her seat behind the bench without ceremony, smoothed the front of her robe, and let her eyes travel once across the room. Lawyers adjusted their ties. A bailiff cleared his throat. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman coughed and apologized to no one in particular. Ordinary sounds, ordinary people. No one here knew what had happened in the garage 10 minutes earlier, and Eleanor intended to keep it that way for now. "All rise," the bailiff said. She rose with the bench, then sat, the motion practiced, almost automatic. Her wrist throbbed beneath the sleeve, a private reminder. She placed both hands flat on the wood, felt the familiar grain beneath her palms, grounding her. "Please be seated." The first case was a traffic matter. Speeding. 42 miles per hour in a 35. The defendant looked nervous, twisting his cap in his hands. Eleanor listened. She always listened. That was her rule. She asked a question. She waited for the answer. She ruled. Calm. Even. Fair. Anyone watching would have seen nothing unusual. Anyone watching would have been wrong. Down the hall behind a frosted glass door marked Security Administration. Robert Hayes sat at his desk and stared at his hands. He flexed his fingers once, then again, as if trying to shake something off. He had handled situations like that one in the garage dozens of times over the years. Loud voices, hurt feelings, people who thought rules didn't apply to them, or people who thought rules applied only to them. He knew how to smooth things over, keep the peace, keep paperwork light. That was his job, whether the manual said it that way or not. Judge Brooks. The name echoed in his head, now unwelcome. He replayed the moment, her voice, her posture, the way she hadn't rushed to correct him, hadn't flashed a badge or raised her status like a shield. She had let him reveal himself first. That realization made his stomach tighten. The phone on his desk rang. He let it ring twice before answering. Security. Hayes, a woman's voice said, clipped, controlled. This is Carol Myers, County Administrator's Office. I just got a call from Frank Carter. Hayes closed his eyes briefly. Yes, ma'am. He's upset, Myers continued. Claims there was an incident in the garage this morning. Says his wife was frightened. Hayes swallowed. There was a misunderstanding. It's been resolved. There was a pause on the line. A long one. Resolved how Myers asked. Hayes chose his words carefully. No charges. No injuries reported. Everyone went on their way. Another pause. He could almost hear her thinking. Judge Brooks was involved, she said, not as a question. Yes. And you didn't document it. I was about to. Hayes said too quickly. Myers exhaled. "Come to my office after lunch." The line went dead. Back in the courtroom, Eleanor called the next case. Her voice was steady, but her mind was elsewhere now, splitting itself cleanly, the way it always did under pressure. One part focused on the law in front of her, the facts, the arguments. The other part replayed the garage, the grip, the sound of Frank's laugh, the way Hayes's eyes had slid past her injury, like it didn't count until it belonged to someone else. She felt something shift in her, then subtle but irreversible. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to resolve. During a short recess, she retreated to her chambers and closed the door behind her. The room was quiet, lined with shelves of bound volumes and framed photographs she rarely looked at anymore. She slipped her robe off and rolled up her sleeve. The mark had darkened to a deep bruise, now fingers clearly outlined. She touched it lightly and winced. A knock sounded. Soft. Careful. "Yes," she said. The door opened just enough for the court reporter, Margaret Lewis, to peer in. Margaret was in her early 70s, hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, glasses perched low on her nose. She had been reporting in this courthouse longer than Eleanor had been practicing law. Judge Margaret said quietly. "Are you all right?" Eleanor studied her face. The concern there was genuine, unpolished. "Why do you ask?" Margaret stepped inside and closed the door. "I heard things she said. Downstairs? In the garage?" Eleanor waited. Margaret hesitated, then spoke. "This isn't the first time." The words landed softly, but they carried weight. Eleanor gestured for her to sit. Margaret did, folding her hands in her lap. "People like Mr. Hayes." Margaret continued, lowering her voice. "They've been deciding which problems matter for a long time. Who gets listened to? Who doesn't?" Eleanor felt a slow burn begin behind her ribs. "Why hasn't anyone said anything?" Margaret's mouth tightened. "People have, over the years. Complaints get filed, then they disappear. Folks learn what's worth fighting and what isn't." Eleanor thought of her brother, then unbidden. Samuel's face as she remembered it, young, stubborn, full of a quiet pride that had never sat well with authority. She hadn't thought about him this morning. She rarely did any more. It hurt too much. But now his memory pressed in, insistent. "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor said. Margaret nodded. "I thought you should know." She stood, paused at the door. "Be careful." After she left, Eleanor sat alone for a long moment, listening to the hum of the building. She could hear footsteps outside, voices rising and falling, life continuing. She reached for her phone and typed a short message to her clerk. "Need to see incident report procedures. Today." The afternoon docket passed in a blur. Eleanor ruled. She listened. She took notes. She maintained the mask. When the last case concluded and the courtroom emptied, she remained seated for a moment, staring at the bent in front of her. This bent had been her goal, once her proof that perseverance mattered. She had believed the system bent toward fairness, because she had bent herself to it. Now she wasn't so sure. Downstairs, Hayes sat in Carol Myers's office, his back straight, hands clasped. Myers leaned against her desk, arms crossed. "You understand how this looks," she said. Yes, ma'am. A county judge assaulted on county property. Myers continued. And you chose not to call law enforcement. I assessed the situation, Hayes said. There was no ongoing threat. Myers's eyes hardened. That's not your call. Hayes felt a flicker of something then. Defensiveness, fear. I've been doing this job a long time. And that's part of the problem, Myers replied. Write it up. Everything. Names, times. No omissions. Hayes nodded. He stood to leave, then stopped. What about the Carters? Myers sighed. They've already called their attorney. That evening, Eleanor walked back through the garage alone. The space was quieter now, shadows stretching long between the pillars. She paused near the spot where it had happened, looking at the concrete as if it might speak. She imagined all the other mornings that had passed here unnoticed, all the small injustices that had evaporated before anyone with power had to see them. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Be careful who you trust. Not everyone wants this on the record. She stared at the screen, then slipped the phone into her pocket. Above her, the courthouse loomed, brick and glass catching the last light of day. Inside, files were being locked away, doors closed, decisions deferred. Eleanor squared her shoulders and walked to her car. She did not know yet how far this would go. She did not know who would try to stop her or how. She only knew the grip on her wrist had left more than a bruise. It had left a question she could no longer ignore, and questions once asked had a way of demanding answers. The engine turned over. Eleanor pulled out of the garage, the building receding in her rearview mirror, unaware that somewhere in its depths, old records waited, and that the quiet routines of the place were already beginning to fracture. The letter arrived 2 days later, slipped under Eleanor Brooks's chamber's door, without a knock, without a name, without the courtesy of a stamp. Cream paper, cheap envelope, the kind meant to disappear among memos if you let it. She didn't let it. She stood at her desk, the courthouse quieting around her as evening settled, and opened it with a fingertip. Stop digging. Some things are buried for a reason. No signature. No threat spelled out. Just the implication, heavy as humidity before a storm. Eleanor folded the letter once and set it beside her keyboard. Her wrist still ached when she bent it. The bruise had turned a deep purple, then yellow at the edges, as if time itself were trying to soften what memory refused to release. She did not call anyone. She did not show the letter to her clerk. She opened a fresh document and began to type not notes, not orders, but a timeline. Dates, names, procedures. The way the system claimed to work. The way it actually did. She had learned long ago that clarity was a form of armor. Across town, Frank Carter sat in his den, with the television on mute, watching the crawl of local news without seeing it. His wife paced the carpet behind him, phone pressed to her ear, voice low and urgent. No, you don't understand, Linda said. She's a judge. An actual judge. Yes, the one at the county courthouse. She listened, nodded sharply. We were afraid. That matters, doesn't it? Frank closed his eyes. Fear had always been his excuse. Fear of losing ground. Fear of being mistaken for someone who didn't belong. He had never imagined it could turn around on him this fast. You shouldn't have touched her. Linda hissed, covering the receiver. Frank snapped his eyes open. I didn't know. You didn't care, she shot back. The line clicked. Linda lowered the phone slowly. Our attorney says not to talk to anyone, especially not security. Frank stared at his hands. They looked the same as they always had. Strong, steady. He flexed them once, remembering the feel of resistance, the sudden give. A flicker of doubt crept in, unwelcome. He pushed it away. People like him didn't get punished for misunderstandings. They got explanations. They got leeway. At the courthouse, Robert Hayes stared at the blank incident report on his screen. He had filled out hundreds of them over the years. Slips, falls, lost property, raised voices. This one refused to behave. Every sentence he typed felt heavier than the last, as if the words themselves were pushing back. Time of incident, location, parties involved. He hesitated over the last line. Injuries observed. He thought of the judge's wrist, the way he had deliberately not looked at it. His fingers hovered, then typed none reported. The lie sat there, neat and contained. Hayes leaned back in his chair, exhaled. That was better. Cleaner. A knock on his open door made him jump. Hayes, a voice said. You got a minute? It was Mark Delaney from Facilities. Early 60s. Shoulders stooped from years of carrying boxes. No one else wanted to move. Hayes nodded, motioning him in. Words going around, Mark said, lowering himself into the chair across from the desk. About what happened. Hayes stiffened. People talk. They do. Mark agreed. He glanced at the screen, then away. You know, back when I started here, we had a storage room in the old wing, basement level, before they renovated. Hayes's jaw tightened. What about it? Just saying. Mark continued, voice mild. A lot of paperwork went down there when folks didn't want to deal with it. Complaints, grievances, stuff that made people uncomfortable. Hayes closed the report window with a click. That wing's been closed for years. Mark shrugged. Doors get locked. Keys get lost. Doesn't mean what's inside disappears. After he left, Hayes sat alone, the hum of the computer filling the silence. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You should fix this before it fixes you. He deleted it without replying, but the words lingered, sticky and insistent. Eleanor spent the evening at her kitchen table, files spread out like a map of quiet betrayals. Public records, old cases, names that appeared more than once in the margins. She moved slowly, deliberately, letting patterns reveal themselves at their own pace. She did not rush. Rushing led to mistake. And mistakes were a luxury she could not afford. Her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Margaret Lewis. Judge Margaret said when Eleanor answered. I hope I'm not calling too late. You're not, Eleanor replied. Margaret hesitated. I've been thinking about what you asked, about procedures, and Eleanor prompted. There are things that never made it into the system, Margaret said. Not officially. I kept copies, not of everything, just enough to remember. Eleanor felt a slow tightening in her chest, where Margaret exhaled. In a box, at home. I didn't think I'd ever need them. When can we talk? Eleanor asked. Soon Margaret said. But not here. Not yet. After the call ended, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Too quiet. She wondered how many nights her brother had spent like this, waiting for something to shift, to make sense, to give. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with a different energy. Subtle. Edges sharper. Conversations paused when Eleanor passed, then resumed in lower tones. She took her seat on the bench and felt eyes on her curious, wary. She had been invisible in many ways before. Now she was something else. The bailiff called the room to order. Eleanor nodded, then surprised herself by pausing before the first case. She looked out at the gallery, at the faces lined by years, by labor, by quiet endurance. She thought of the letter, the bruise, the report that had not been written the way it should have been. Before we begin, she said, her voice carrying easily, I want to remind everyone that this court exists to hear the truth. All of it. A ripple moved through the room. A few people shifted in their seats. Eleanor continued, measured, deliberate. That includes truths that make us uncomfortable. In the back row, a man Eleanor recognized only vaguely leaned forward, his hands clasped tight. He had been a clerk once, long ago. He met her gaze and looked away. During the lunch break, Carol Myers called Eleanor into her office. The administrator's smile was tight professional. Judge Brooks, she said. I wanted to check in. About the garage, Eleanor replied. Myers nodded. About the situation, yes. We're conducting an internal review. Eleanor studied her face. Saw the caution there, the calculation. I'll cooperate fully, she said, as long as the review is complete. Myers's smile wavered. Of course. Outside in the hallway, Eleanor paused by a window overlooking the parking lot. Sunlight glinted off windshields. People came and went, small against the scale of the building. She thought of all the mornings that had passed without incident, all the ones that hadn't. Her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Basement level. Old wing. Bring a coat. Eleanor did not reply. She slipped the phone into her pocket and walked back toward her chambers. Her step steady, her expression unreadable. Somewhere below her feet, behind locked doors and dust, the past waited. And above it all, the machinery of the courthouse continued to turn, unaware that one of its own had decided to listen, really listen to what it had been trying so hard not to hear. The stairwell door groaned as Eleanor pushed it open, the sound echoing down concrete steps that smelled of dust and something older like damp paper, left too long in the dark. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and began the descent, each step deliberate. Her hand brushing the cold metal rail. The courthouse above her continued its day, phones ringing, printers, humming, voices rising and falling. Down here, there was only the slow thud of her shoes and the whisper of her breath. The basement level was dim lights, half-switched a long corridor stretching out like a forgotten sentence. Pipes ran along the ceiling, wrapped in yellowed insulation. At the far end, a figure waited near a door with peeling paint. He straightened when he saw her. Judge Mark Delaney said, quietly, I was hoping you'd come. Eleanor stopped a few feet from him. I don't usually take instructions from anonymous texts. Mark managed a thin smile. Fair enough. I didn't want to put it in writing. He glanced down the corridor, then back at her. This place isn't on any current map. Officially, it doesn't exist. He pulled a ring of keys from his pocket, heavy, mismatched. The door resisted at first, then gave with a reluctant click. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of cardboard and mildew. Rows of shelves lined the walls, boxes stacked unevenly, labels faded or torn away. Eleanor stepped inside and felt something shift in her chest. Not surprise, recognition. How long has this been here? Longer than me, Mark said. And I've been here a while. He reached for a box near the front and slid it out. Dust puffed into the air. Facilities used to be the last stop for things nobody wanted to deal with. We'd get a call. Clear this out. Store that downstairs. No one ever came back for it. Eleanor knelt, ignoring the ache in her knee, and opened the box. File folders stared back at her edges, curled names, scrawled in ink. She lifted one at random and scanned the contents. Complaint. Date from decades earlier. Allegations of misconduct. Disposition unresolved. Her jaw tightened. People tried, Mark said. Softly. They always did. Eleanor rose slowly. Why show me? Now. Mark hesitated. Because you're still here. Most folks who start asking questions don't last. They retire. They transfer. They decide it's not worth it. And you? Eleanor asked. Mark shrugged. I'm close to the end anyway. Footsteps echoed faintly from the corridor. Both of them froze. A flashlight beam swept past the open door, then moved on. Voices murmured, faded. Eleanor closed the box. We can't do this alone. Mark nodded. I figured. Upstairs, Robert Hayes stood in the hallway, outside Carol Myers' office. His tie loosened his patience, fraying. The internal review had grown teeth faster than he'd expected. Questions, requests, dates he couldn't remember, and files he couldn't find. Myers' emerged phone pressed to her ear. She motioned for Hayes to wait, her eyes sharp. When she finished the call, she sighed. We have a problem. Hayes stiffened. Define problem. Judge Brooks has requested records, Myers said. From before the renovation, before digital storage. Hayes felt a cold slide down his spine. Those records were purged. So I thought Myers replied. Apparently not. Hayes swallowed. This is getting out of hand. Myers fixed him with a look. It got out of hand the moment you decided to handle that garage incident informally. He bristled. I did what I always do. And that she said is exactly what people are starting to question. Hayes left her office with his jaw clenched, his mind racing. He thought of the basement, the old wing. The things he'd assumed were gone. He pulled out his phone and typed a message, then deleted it. Typed again. Sent. Need to talk. Now. Across town, Margaret Lewis sat at her dining table, a cardboard box open in front of her. Papers spread like a quiet confession. She had kept them out of habit at first, then out of fear, then because throwing them away felt like erasing people who had already been erased once. She checked the clock. Early evening. She closed the box and reached for her coat. Eleanor was back in her chambers when the knock came. Margaret entered without waiting for permission, her eyes bright with something like resolve. "I brought what I have," Margaret said, setting the box on the desk. "It's not everything." Eleanor met her gaze. "It's enough." They worked in silence for a long while, sorting reading, cross-referencing. Names emerged. Patterns, familiar tactics repeated across years. Delay, dismissal, disappearance. "This one," Margaret said, tapping a file. "That was handled by Hayes, long before he was supervisor." Eleanor scanned it, her fingers tightening on the paper. "And this judge," she said, indicating another name. "Thomas Reed." Margaret nodded. "He signed off on a lot of things." The weight of it pressed down on the room. Eleanor leaned back, exhaled. "We need to be careful." Margaret smiled sadly. We always needed to be careful. That didn't protect anyone. That night, Frank Carter lay awake beside his wife, staring at the ceiling. He could hear her breathing shallow, restless. The house felt smaller than it ever had. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number. "You should apologize." He scoffed and rolled onto his side. "Apologize to whom?" "The judge." "For what?" "A misunderstanding." He closed his eyes, trying to summon the old certainty, the belief that this would pass. It did not come. At the courthouse the next morning, whispers followed Eleanor down the hall like a draft. She felt them, but did not acknowledge them. In the courtroom, she listened to testimony with the same focus she always had. But something had changed. She heard not just words, but the spaces between them, the hesitations, the omissions. During a brief recess, a man approached the bench hesitantly. He was older, hair thinning, hands trembling slightly. "Judge," he said, voice low. "May I speak with you?" Eleanor studied him. "If it concerns a case, you'll need to go through proper channels." "It doesn't," he said. "Not exactly." He glanced around, then leaned closer. "I was a clerk here. Years ago. I saw things." Eleanor felt the tempo of the room shift like a held breath. "What kind of things?" "Files disappearing," he said. "People being told to stop asking questions." I didn't speak up. Shame crept into his eyes. "I'm sorry." Eleanor nodded once. "Thank you for telling me now." In Carol Myers's office, the phone rang again. Another inquiry. Another request for documentation. She rubbed her temples. The building felt different, as if the walls themselves were listening. By afternoon, Hayes could no longer sit still. He walked the halls, his presence no longer the quiet authority it once had been. People watched him now, measured him. He caught his reflection in a window and barely recognized himself. He found Eleanor in the corridor outside her chambers. "Judge," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "We need to talk." Eleanor faced him, her expression unreadable. "I agree." "About the garage," Hayes continued. "About procedures. I may have made an error in judgment." "May have," Eleanor echoed. Hayes swallowed. "I'd like to correct the record." "Good," Eleanor said. Because the record has been wrong for a long time. He flinched, the truth landing harder than accusation. That evening, as Eleanor left the courthouse, she paused at the top of the basement stairs. The door below stood ajar, light spilling out. Voices murmured inside. Not secretive, not hurried, just people finally speaking. She took one step down, then another. The air felt heavy, but she moved forward anyway, her resolve firm. The system had not collapsed. It had begun to speak reluctantly under pressure. And once spoken, some truths could not be locked away again. The first subpoena arrived before Eleanor Brooks finished her morning coffee. It sat on her kitchen counter, heavy with implication. The county seal crisp and official, a reminder that once the machinery of the system woke up, it did not move quietly. She read it once, then again, her expression unchanged. Records requested, dates spanning decades, names she now knew too well. Someone somewhere had decided this could no longer be handled in hallways and basements. By the time she reached the courthouse, the building felt different. Not louder, not more chaotic, sharper. Conversations cut off when she passed. Doors closed a second too fast. Eyes lingered, measuring. Eleanor felt it all without reacting, her posture steady, her pace unhurried. Control, she knew, was contagious. So was fear. In her chambers, Margaret Lewis was already waiting, seated stiffly, with her hands folded over her purse. "I heard," Margaret said without preamble. Eleanor nodded. "So it's begun?" Margaret exhaled. "I never thought I'd see this." Eleanor set her bag down and met the older woman's gaze. "That doesn't mean it will end the way it should." Margaret's mouth tightened. "It rarely does." Across the hall, Robert Hayes stood in front of a mirror in the men's restroom, adjusting his tie for the third time. His reflection looked older than he remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper. He had slept poorly, dreams filled with corridors that led nowhere and doors that would not open. The subpoena had reached his desk less than an hour earlier. Facilities, security procedures, incident reports going back years. He turned away from the mirror and splashed water on his face. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. He had genuinely believed, that the way he handled things kept the courthouse functioning, that small compromises prevented bigger disasters. Now those compromises had names. Dates, files. In Carol Myers's office, the phone would not stop ringing. County counsel, outside auditors, a reporter she did not recognize, asking careful questions. Carol sat rigid behind her desk, legal pad, filling with notes she barely registered. She had spent years balancing budgets and personalities, smoothing rough edges without ever examining what lay beneath them. That luxury was gone. "We need a unified response," she said into the phone. No speculation, no commentary. When the call ended, she leaned back and stared at the ceiling. For the first time, she wondered if the building she thought she managed had been managing her all along. The Carters' attorney requested a meeting that afternoon. Eleanor declined, not out of spite, but out of principle. The case was now part of a larger inquiry, and she would not contaminate it with private conversations. Frank Carter did not take the news well. "They're for turning this into something it isn't," he snapped, pacing his living room. "We were scared. That's all." Linda watched him from the couch, her face pale. "Frank," she said quietly, They have the footage. He stopped. What footage? The cameras, she replied. The attorney said they recovered more than we thought. Frank sank into a chair, the confidence draining out of him in slow, unmistakable stages. He had built his life on the assumption that there were limits to accountability, that people like him were shielded by familiarity and time. Those shields felt thin now. In the courthouse, Eleanor convened a meeting with her clerk and a representative from county council. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing the careful language, the caveats, the emphasis on process. When she did speak, it was to ask questions that cut through the noise. Who controls access to archived records, she asked. Facilities Council replied. Historically. And oversight. There wasn't much, the lawyer admitted. Not until recently. Eleanor nodded. That's what needs to change. Word spread quickly, not through official channels, but through the human ones. Clerks whispered to each other in break rooms. Bailiffs exchanged looks. A few people approached Eleanor with hesitant stories, small pieces of a larger pattern they had never quite been able to name. She received them all with the same quiet attention, never promising outcomes she could not deliver. Late that afternoon, Margaret knocked on Eleanor's door again. Her expression strained. "They're asking for my testimony," she said, "about the records." Eleanor studied her. "Are you willing?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "I'm tired of carrying this alone." Eleanor reached out and covered Margaret's hand briefly. "So am I." Downstairs, Mark Delaney watched as boxes were removed from the basement room, catalogued and sealed. The space looked smaller without them, emptier, like a confession finally spoken aloud. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. He had spent years avoiding attention. Now attention had found him anyway. A man in a suit approached him, badge clipped to his belt. "Mr. Delaney," he said, "we may need to ask you some questions." Mark nodded. "I figured." As evening fell, Eleanor remained in her chambers, reading through newly surfaced files. One in particular held her attention. Its pages brittle with age. A familiar name appeared in the margins, handwritten circled once. Her brother's case was not there in full, but echoes of it were. Procedures bent, evidence delayed. Decisions made in rooms without windows. Her chest tightened, grief threading itself through the anger she had kept at bay. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself the space to feel it. Then she opened them and turned the page. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, shorter this time. "You're not as untouchable as you think." She deleted it and set the phone face down. Fear, she knew, often announced itself when it was losing ground. The next morning, the courtroom was packed, not for a sensational case, but for a routine hearing that had somehow become a spectacle. Reporters filled the back rows, notebooks, ready eyes sharp. Eleanor took her seat, her expression composed, her movements precise. "All rise." She waited for the room to settle before speaking. "This court will proceed as scheduled," she said. "Disruptions will not be tolerated." The message was clear. Justice did not pause for scrutiny. It endured it. During a break, Robert Hayes requested a private conversation. Eleanor agreed on the record, with counsel present. Hayes sat stiffly across from her, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened. "I want to correct my statement," he said, voice low, "regarding the incident in the garage." Eleanor did not react. "Go on." "I observed an injury," Hayes continued. "I failed to document it." Silence settled over the room, heavy and absolute. Hayes swallowed. That was wrong. Eleanor met his eyes. "Why now?" He hesitated. "Because pretending it didn't happen doesn't make it go away." Eleanor nodded once. "That will be noted." When the meeting ended, she felt no satisfaction, only a sober acknowledgement of how much work remained. That night, Eleanor stood in her living room, lights off the city, a low hum beyond the windows. She thought of the people who had come forward, the ones who still wouldn't, the ones who never could. She thought of the system she had believed in, and the one she was now confronting. Change, she knew, was rarely loud at first. It began with documents pulled from boxes with truths, spoken in small rooms with people deciding one by one that silence was no longer safer than speech. She turned off the lamp and headed for bed, aware that tomorrow would bring more questions, more resistance, more cost. She welcomed it. The bruise on her wrist had faded, but the imprint of that moment remained not as a wound, but as a line drawn clear and irrevocable. The hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning, but the hallway outside the administrative courtroom filled an hour early. Eleanor Brooks arrived alone, walking past clusters of people who pretended not to stare. Reporters murmured into phones. A pair of younger attorneys whispered near the water fountain, their voices dropping when she passed. Someone she had known for years nodded without smiling. The building felt narrower today, as if the walls had leaned in overnight. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick and unmoving. This was not her courtroom. She sat at the counsel table instead of the bench her robe replaced by a dark suit she had not worn in years. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Power, she knew, was often about where you were allowed to sit. Margaret Lewis slipped into the seat beside her, her posture straight, despite the tremor in her hands. "I didn't sleep," Margaret murmured. "Neither did I." Eleanor replied. Across the room, Robert Hayes sat with county counsel. His shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the table. He looked smaller here. Diminished by the setting, by the fact that he could not control what came next. When he glanced up and caught Eleanor's gaze, he looked away quickly. The panel entered without ceremony. 3 members, 1 from the county, 1 from the State Oversight Committee, 1 appointed to give the appearance of neutrality. They took their seats, shuffled papers, adjusted microphones. Routine movements, formal faces. This proceeding concerns allegations of procedural misconduct and failure to report incidents occurring on county property. The chair began. "We will hear testimony and review documentation." Eleanor listened, her hands folded loosely in front of her. She felt the familiar urge to take control of the room, to clarify, to direct. She resisted it. This was not about command. It was about exposure. The first witness was a junior security officer, young, nervous, his voice cracking as he described being told to stand down on multiple occasions. "It was just how things were done," he said. "We were told not to escalate." "By whom?" the panel asked. He hesitated, then answered. "By my supervisors." Hayes's jaw tightened. Next came Mark Delaney. He spoke slowly, carefully. His words weighed down by years of restraint. He described the basement room, The boxes, the informal system of storage that had become a graveyard for unresolved complaints. He did not embellish. He did not editorialize. He simply told the truth. Margaret was called shortly before noon. She rose with effort, smoothing her jacket, and took the oath. Her voice was steadier than Eleanor expected. She spoke of copies kept of records, altered or delayed, of a culture that prized quiet over correction. "People think silence is neutral," Margaret said. "It isn't. It takes a side." The room was still when she finished. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, just slightly. Hayes was called after lunch. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and began with the prepared statement his attorney had no doubt helped him craft. Years of service. Good faith decisions. No intent to harm. Eleanor listened, her expression unchanged. Then the chair leaned forward. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "did you observe an injury on the morning of the incident involving Judge Brooks?" Hayes swallowed. "Yes." "And did you document it?" "No." "Why not?" Hayes hesitated. The room held its breath. "Because," he said finally, "I didn't think it mattered." The words landed heavily undeniable in their honesty. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them, she saw not triumph, but something closer to grief. How many times had that calculation been made? How many times had it erased someone? The hearing adjourned late in the afternoon, the panel retreating to deliberate. No conclusions were announced, no statements given. The crowd dispersed slowly, conversations resuming in hushed tones. Eleanor gathered her things, her movements unhurried. Outside, the sky had darkened, clouds hanging low and heavy. Margaret walked with her toward the exit. "Whatever happens," Margaret said, "thank you." Eleanor nodded. "You didn't do this for me." Margaret smiled faintly. "No. I did it for the people who never got a chance." They parted at the doors. Eleanor stepped out into the cool air, drawing a deep breath. The city moved around her, indifferent and relentless. She reached her car and paused, a sudden weariness settling into her bones. Her phone buzzed. "Private number." She answered without speaking. "You've made your point," a man's voice said. "Older. Controlled. There's no need to keep pushing." Eleanor recognized it immediately, though they had never spoken directly before. "Thomas Reed." "Is that so?" she replied. "You're damaging institutions people rely on." Reed continued. "Public confidence is fragile." Eleanor leaned against her car, the metal cold through her coat. "So are people." There was a pause. "You should consider stepping back," Reed said. "For your own sake." Eleanor smiled, though he could not see it. "I already have," she said. "That's how I know what I'm looking at." The line went dead. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her living room, files spread around her like constellations. She no longer tried to separate her role as judge from her role as witness. They had converged whether anyone liked it or not. She thought of her brother again, more clearly this time. Not just the loss, but the context. The unanswered questions. The quiet decisions that had shaped his fate without ever being spoken aloud. The next morning brought headlines. Not dramatic, not explosive. Careful wording. Administrative review underway. Questions raised. a system beginning reluctantly to look at itself. At the courthouse, Carol Myers called Eleanor into her office. Her composure had frayed. "We're under pressure from multiple sides," Carol said. "State oversight, media, donors," and Eleanor asked. "And I'm asking you," Carol said, "what you want." Eleanor considered the question. For years she had wanted fairness, believing it could be achieved through individual rulings, one case at a time. Now she wanted something narrower and harder. "I want the truth preserved," she said, "even if nothing else changes." Carol nodded slowly. "That may be the most disruptive thing you could ask for." Eleanor stood to leave. Disruption isn't always destruction. As she walked back through the halls, she noticed small changes. A clerk meeting her eyes instead of looking away. A security officer straightening, uncertain but attentive. The building was not transformed. It was unsettled. That would have to be enough for now. She returned to her chambers and closed the door, the familiar quiet enveloping her. On her desk lay a new file, recently added, its cover blank. She opened it and began to write her pen, moving steadily across the page. The system had not fallen. It had resisted, shifted, revealed cracks. Eleanor understood now that justice was not a single act, nor a single victory. It was a sustained refusal to accept that some harms mattered less than others. She wrote until the light outside her window began to fade, until the words on the page blurred slightly. When she finally set the pen down, she felt no relief, only resolve. Whatever came next would not be clean. It would not be quick. But it would be seen. And sometimes being seen was the first thing that made change possible. The vote did not come with an announcement or a press conference. It arrived as a thin email forwarded by County Council late on a Friday afternoon, its language cautious, its conclusions narrow. Procedural failures acknowledged, recommendations issued, disciplinary measures pending further review. No names attached, no timelines promised. The kind of outcome that looked reasonable on paper and hollow everywhere else. Eleanor Brooks read it once, then closed her laptop without comment. By Monday morning, the courthouse had absorbed the decision the way it absorbed everything else quietly, without ceremony. People returned to routines. Calendars filled. The system exhaled, relieved it had not been asked to change too much, too fast. Eleanor felt the shift immediately. Doors that had opened now hesitated. Conversations that had been offered freely were replaced with careful nods. The unspoken message was clear. Enough had been said. In her chambers, Margaret Lewis sat stiffly, hands clasped, eyes bright with contained frustration. "That's it?" she asked. For now, Eleanor replied. Margaret shook her head. "They're waiting you out." Eleanor met her gaze. "I know." Downstairs, Robert Hayes packed his desk in stages, his reassignment framed as temporary, administrative a step aside rather than a removal. He moved slowly, placing pens in a box, straightening papers that no longer belonged to him. People passed without stopping, some avoiding his eyes, others offering sympathetic murmurs. No one asked what he planned to do next. He wasn't sure himself. He paused with a framed photo in his hands, taken years earlier at a courthouse picnic. Faces he barely recognized smiled back at him. He set it down again, leaving it behind. Some things he understood now, were easier to abandon than explain. Across town, Frank Carter sat in his attorney's office, the blinds drawn against the afternoon sun. The man across from him spoke in measured tones about charges and plea options, about optics and mitigation. Frank heard only fragments. Assault, the attorney said at one point, and false reporting. The words felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else's life. Linda sat beside him silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had stopped defending him days ago. The certainty that had once bound them together had fractured, replaced by something brittle and raw. "They're making an example of us," Frank muttered. The attorney met his eyes. "No," he said. "They're making a record." At the courthouse, Eleanor resumed her docket with the same discipline she had always brought to it. She listened. She ruled. She maintained the appearance of continuity. But beneath it, something had shifted irreversibly. She was no longer under the illusion that exposure alone guaranteed accountability. Systems she understood now were adept at surviving truth. During a break, a young public defender approached her, hesitating at the edge of the bench. "Judge Brooks," she said quietly. "May I ask you something?" Eleanor nodded. "Does it ever feel—" The attorney continued, choosing her words carefully, like pushing back costs more than it's worth. Eleanor studied her face, saw the fatigue there, the idealism worn thin by repetition. "It always costs something," she said. "The question is, who pays if you don't?" The attorney nodded slowly, absorbing that, and stepped away. That afternoon, Eleanor received another message from an unknown number. "You've done enough. Let it rest." She did not reply. Instead, she opened a new folder on her desk and labeled it simply "Ongoing." Inside, she placed copies of everything that had surfaced, everything that had been half addressed and quietly deferred. She added notes, cross-references, names of people who had come forward and those who hadn't. The file grew heavier by the hour. Late that evening, Carol Myers knocked on her door. The administrator looked tired, her composure frayed around the edges. "I wanted you to hear this from me," Carol said. "The county commission is concerned about continued scrutiny. They think it's time to move forward." Eleanor gestured for her to sit. "Move forward? How?" "By closing the chapter," Carol replied. "By reassuring the public." "And the unresolved issues?" Eleanor asked. Carol sighed. "Those take time." Eleanor leaned back, her gaze steady. "Time favors the people who can afford to wait." Carol did not disagree. After she left, Eleanor remained alone, the building settling into its evening quiet. She thought of the people who had trusted her with their stories, the ones who had risked something by speaking. She thought of her brother again, the way his absence had shaped her, without her ever fully acknowledging it. She reached for her phone and dialed a number she had memorized years ago but rarely used. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Eleanor," the voice said. "I wondered when you'd call. I need to ask you something." Eleanor replied. "Off the record." The conversation was brief, careful, its implications significant. When she hung up, the weight in her chest felt heavier, but clearer. The following week, a small article appeared in the local paper. Not on the front page. Not sensational. It mentioned archived complaints, procedural gaps, a recommendation for state-level review. It cited unnamed sources. It raised questions without offering answers. By noon, Eleanor's phone buzzed steadily. Messages from colleagues in other counties. A retired judge she barely knew. A former clerk now practicing privately. Each note carried the same theme expressed differently. You're not alone. This isn't just your courthouse. She sat back, absorbing that. The story was no longer contained, no matter how much the system preferred it to be. In court that afternoon, a man stood before her on a minor charge, his hands shaking as he spoke. He glanced up at her eyes, searching, uncertain. Do you think he asked suddenly that any of this matters? The question caught the room off guard. Eleanor paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to honor it. It matters, she said. When someone is paying attention. The man nodded, something easing in his posture. As days passed, resistance hardened. Invitations disappeared. Committees formed without her. Eleanor felt the isolation keenly, a quiet pressure that pressed in from all sides. There were moments alone at night when doubt crept close, whispering that perhaps this was as far as it would go. Then a package arrived at her home, no return address. Inside, carefully wrapped, were photocopies of documents she had never seen before. Older, deeper. A note attached in careful handwriting. Found these while cleaning out my office. Thought you should have them. Eleanor sat at her table until dawn, reading, annotating, piecing together a pattern that extended beyond her courthouse, beyond her county. The scope was larger than she had imagined. So were the implications. She knew then that whatever the cost, she could not stop. Not now. Not when the truth was still unfolding, still asking to be named. By the end of the week, another message arrived, this one unmistakably hostile. Last warning. Eleanor deleted it without hesitation. She stood at her window, the city lights flickering below, and felt a familiar calm settle over her. Not peace. Readiness. The system might slow her. It might try to contain her. But it could no longer pretend she had not seen what she had seen. And once seen, some things could not be unseen. The state review was announced, quietly buried beneath zoning updates and school board votes, but its impact rippled outward almost immediately. Eleanor Brooks learned about it from a voicemail left on her office phone just after she had finished a morning docket. A neutral voice, formal language, an assurance of cooperation requested. Oversight had arrived not as a cavalry charge, but as a slow, methodical presence that unsettled everyone who had counted on fatigue to end the story. By lunchtime, unfamiliar faces moved through the courthouse halls, men and women with clipboards and badges that did not belong to any local department. They spoke softly, asked precise questions, took notes without reacting. They did not smile. They did not reassure. They observed. Carol Myers watched them from her office doorway, arms folded tightly across her chest. "This is bigger than I expected," she admitted when Eleanor joined her. "It always is," Eleanor replied. Down in the records room, boxes were reopened under official supervision, each file logged, each movement documented. What had once been informal, easily dismissed, was now fixed in process. Mark Delaney stood to one side, hands clasped behind his back. his face pale but resolute. When an investigator asked him to describe how records were handled before the renovation, he did not soften the truth. "We were told efficiency mattered," he said, "not completeness." The investigator nodded once and wrote that down. Robert Hayes watched from the periphery, his reassignment now officially extended. He had hoped the pause would be enough, that time would dull the scrutiny. Instead, it sharpened it. He was interviewed twice that week, each session peeling away another layer of justification, until only the bare decisions remained. "Did you ever consider the cumulative impact of these choices?" one investigator asked. Hayes stared at the table. "No," he said quietly. "I considered the moment in front of me." "That's often the problem," the investigator replied. Across town, Frank Carter sat in a conference room with his attorney. The walls too white, the air too still. The plea agreement lay open between them. Reduced charges in exchange for admission, probation, mandatory counseling, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The words blurred together. "They want a statement," Frank said hoarsely. "They want accountability," the attorney corrected. Linda sat beside him, her hands folded, her gaze distant. "Say it," she said. "Just say it." Frank closed his eyes. The old certainty was gone now, replaced by a hollow ache. He nodded once. In court, Eleanor continued her work, the rhythms of procedure anchoring her, even as everything around her shifted. She felt the scrutiny keenly. Every ruling examined. Every word passed for implication. She welcomed it. Transparency, she knew, was a discipline. One afternoon, a young woman approached her, after a hearing lingering as the room emptied. She was nervous, clutching a worn folder to her chest. "Judge Brooks," she said. "I don't know if this is the right place." Eleanor waited. "My father worked security here years ago," the woman continued. "He tried to file a complaint. Nothing happened. He got sick. Died before he could retire." Her voice wavered. "I found his notes. I don't know what to do with them." Eleanor took the folder gently. "You did the right thing bringing them here." The woman exhaled relief, softening her features. "Thank you." The file joined the growing stack, each one a testament to the cost of silence. That evening, Eleanor met Margaret Lewis at a quiet diner just outside town. The place smelled of coffee and fried onions, the kind of place that had outlasted trends by refusing to change. They sat in a booth near the window, steam rising from their mugs. "I never thought I'd see state oversight in my lifetime," Margaret said, stirring her coffee. "I always assumed things would just stay the way they were." "Systems rely on that assumption," Eleanor replied. "That people will outweight them." Margaret studied her. "You're tired." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Yes." "And you're not stopping," Margaret said. "No." Outside, rain streaked the glass, blurring the streetlights into soft halos. Eleanor watched it for a moment, letting the quiet settle. The following week brought a public forum hastily organized and poorly advertised. Folding chairs filled the community room, occupied by people who had learned not to expect much from such gatherings. Eleanor sat near the back, anonymous, in plain clothes, listening as officials spoke about commitments and improvements. Then the floor opened. An older man stood leaning heavily on a cane. His voice shook as he spoke. I filed a complaint 15 years ago. Nothing happened. I was told to move on. Murmurs rippled through the room. I'm still here, he finished. I didn't move on. Another woman followed. Then another. Stories layered over each other, distinct yet eerily similar. Eleanor felt the weight of them settle into her bones, heavy and undeniable. At the front of the room, Carol Myers shifted uncomfortably, her prepared remarks forgotten. This was not a narrative she could manage. Later that night, Eleanor received a call from a number she recognized. Thomas Reed again. You've escalated this, he said without preamble. No, Eleanor replied. I've refused to de-escalate it. Reed sighed. You're forcing hands. Good, she said. They've been idle too long. There was a pause. You're dismantling trust, Reed said. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. Trust built on silence deserves to be dismantled. The line went dead. Days blurred into each other, marked by interviews, filings, quiet confessions offered in hallways and over coffee. Eleanor felt the toll of it in her body, the stiffness in her joints, the ache behind her eyes. She rested when she could. She pressed on when she couldn't. One evening, as she prepared to leave the courthouse, she found a note on her desk. Not anonymous this time. A name she recognized. A clerk who had transferred years ago. I should have spoken up sooner. Thank you for making it possible now. Eleanor folded the note and slipped it into her bag. Outside, the air was cool, the sky clear. She stood for a moment on the courthouse steps, looking out at the city she had served for decades. It looked the same, brick and glass, light and shadow. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The story was no longer about a single incident in a garage. It had become a reckoning with memory, with pattern, with the quiet agreements that had shaped lives. As she walked to her car, Eleanor felt a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. She did not know how this would end. She only knew it would not end quietly. The machinery had been set in motion, not by outrage or spectacle, but by persistence, by attention, by the refusal to accept that some harms were too old, too inconvenient, too uncomfortable to matter, and that she understood was the kind of force systems struggled most to contain. The plea hearing was set for a grey Tuesday morning, the kind that dulled sound and made even familiar rooms feel exposed. Eleanor sat in the gallery, not on the bench, not behind the seal. Just another observer with her hands folded in her lap. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant. The ceiling fans hummed. Every small noise carried. Frank Carter stood when his name was called. He looked older than his years. Shoulders slightly rounded, jaw tight. Linda rose beside him, her face carefully composed, eyes fixed forward, as if movement itself might betray her. Their attorney whispered once more, then stepped back. The judge asked the questions, slowly, methodically. Each one requiring a clear answer. Do you understand the charge? Do you understand the consequences? Do you waive your right to trial? Frank's voice wavered at first, then steadied. Yes. 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 When it came time for the statement, the room seemed to hold its breath. Frank turned not toward Eleanor, but toward the empty space just above the gallery, as if addressing something larger than the people present. "I made assumptions," he said. "I believed authority was mine because it always had been. I was wrong." His hands clenched at his sides. "I used fear to justify harm. That is on me." Linda's statement followed shorter, clipped, but unmistakable. "I escalated a situation that did not need escalation. I described someone as dangerous because it was easier than examining my own bias." She swallowed. "I accept responsibility." The judge accepted the pleas. Sentencing would follow in due course. Probation, mandatory programs, community service. Public acknowledgement entered into the record. The gavel fell. The sound was final, but not triumphant. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered microphones, rising like antennae. Eleanor slipped past them, head down the noise, blurring into a single dull roar. She did not want spectacle. She wanted the work to continue. It did relentlessly. Within days, the oversight team released preliminary findings. Language careful, conclusions firm. Patterns identified. Failures noted. Recommendations issued. None of it dramatic. All of it devastating in its precision. Robert Hayes received notice of formal disciplinary action. He read it alone in his small apartment, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The words were clinical, but the meaning was unmistakable. Suspension without pay, pending further review. He sank into a chair, the weight of it settling fully for the first time. He thought of all the moments he had chosen convenience over conscience and felt the cost of each one stack upon the next. Mark Delaney was called in as a witness. He answered every question, his voice steady, despite the tightness in his chest. When asked why he had waited so long to speak, he did not deflect. "I was afraid," he said, "and I was wrong to let that fear decide." The public forum reconvened, this time crowded. Faces Eleanor recognized now. Stories layered with names and dates no longer isolated. The room buzzed with a cautious energy, something like hope tempered by long memory. At the back, a woman Eleanor had never met caught her eye. Silver hair pulled back neatly. Hands clasped around a worn handbag. When their gazes met, the woman nodded once, a small gesture heavy with meaning. Later in her chambers, Eleanor met with the oversight lead, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that wasted no time. "This will not be quick," she said. "There will be resistance." "I expect it," Eleanor replied. "You will be scrutinized," the woman continued. "Your rulings, your associations, your past." "I welcome it," Eleanor said. "That's the point." The woman studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good." As weeks passed, the machinery ground forward, policies rewritten, training mandated, reporting channels clarified. Each change modest on its own, together forming a framework that had been missing for decades. Not everyone welcomed it. Anonymous letters arrived, some pleading, some threatening. Eleanor read them all, filed them, refused to let them dictate her course. She felt the strain in quiet moments late at night when the house was still and her thoughts grew loud. She called Margaret more often, then their conversations a steadying presence. "You're allowed to rest," Margaret reminded her gently one evening. "I know," Eleanor said. "I just can't stop yet." One afternoon, Eleanor received a request for a private meeting. Thomas Reed. She agreed, setting it in a neutral conference room, the blinds half drawn. Reed arrived looking tired, the polish dulled. He sat across from her, hands folded. "This has gone further than I anticipated," he admitted. "Truth tends to," Eleanor said. He sighed. "There are consequences beyond this building." "There always are," she replied. Reed met her gaze. "Do you think it's worth it?" Eleanor did not answer immediately. She thought of the young woman with her father's notes, of the older man with the cane, of the silence that had been mistaken for peace. "Yes," she said finally. "I do." Reed nodded once as if accepting a verdict. The final report landed on a Friday afternoon, its release timed to minimize attention, though it did not succeed. Headlines followed. Commentary. Analysis. For a brief moment, the story belonged to the public. Eleanor watched it from a distance, her role deliberately understated. She returned calls she needed to return, ignored those she did not. She focused on the cases before her, the people who stood in her courtroom every day, seeking something fair. On a quiet evening, Eleanor walked through the courthouse alone. The halls echoed softly, the building settling into night. She paused at the entrance to the garage, the concrete cool under her palm. The space looked unchanged, lines painted, lights humming. Yet it felt different now, its history acknowledged rather than ignored. She took a breath and turned away, locking the door behind her. At home, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, the day's fatigue finally catching up. Her phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. "Proud of you." Eleanor smiled faintly and set the phone down. The journey was not finished. Appeals would come. Implementation would lag. Old habits would resist replacement. But the narrative had shifted. Silence was no longer the default. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet hold her. Tomorrow would bring more work, more listening, more choices that mattered. For tonight it was enough to know that something real had moved, however slowly, in a direction that honored the people it had once dismissed, and that she understood was how change endured. The courthouse was quiet in a way Eleanor had never known, not empty, but settled like a place that had exhaled after holding its breath for years. Morning light slid through the tall windows and rested on the floor in long, pale bands. She walked the hallway slowly, her footsteps measured, aware of every echo, every subtle change in the building she had served for most of her life. The new security desk stood where the old one used to be, the wood lighter, the glass cleaner, the posture of the officers different, not rigid, not suspicious, simply present. One of them nodded as she passed, not because of her title, but because that was now the rule. Courtesy without calculation. In her chambers, Eleanor set her bag down and paused. The room looked the same, yet it did not feel the same. Papers were stacked neatly. A mug sat where it always had. But the air carried something else now, a sense of attention, as if the walls themselves had learned to listen. She sat and opened the first file of the day. A tenant dispute. An elderly man with limited income. A landlord who had not followed the law, but believed no one would notice. Eleanor read carefully, her face calm, her mind sharp. This was where change lived, not in headlines, but in these quiet moments where fairness either showed up or failed. Later that morning, the young woman returned the one who had come weeks earlier with her mother. She stood straighter now, hands still clasped, but no longer shaking. Eleanor listened as she spoke every word, landing cleanly in the space between them. When the story ended, Eleanor nodded and explained the process slowly, clearly, without rushing. The woman's shoulders lowered, relief visible. Being heard did that. It made people breathe again. Word traveled not loudly but steadily. People began to file complaints who never would have before. Some arrived angry, some exhausted, some unsure if it would matter. Eleanor met each one with the same attention. Not sympathy that hovered above them, but respect that met them eye to eye. Outside the building, life went on. Frank Carter completed his community service in a food pantry on the edge of town, stacking boxes beside men who did not know his name or his past. Linda attended mandatory counseling sessions, sitting quietly writing more than she spoke. Their lives were smaller now, narrower, shaped by consequences that did not announce themselves, but followed faithfully. Robert Hayes packed his desk in silence. Months later, his suspension made permanent by findings that could not be undone. He left the building without ceremony, the door closing behind him with a sound that was not dramatic, only final. Thomas Reed kept his distance after that last meeting. His public statements were careful, measured, filled with words like transition and progress. Eleanor did not seek him out again. Their paths no longer needed to cross. The oversight reports continued thick with detail. Language dry and unyielding. Training programs rolled out. Reporting lines were redrawn. Some resisted. Some adapted. The system did not collapse. It adjusted reluctantly, unevenly, but unmistakably. There were costs Eleanor felt in private. Invitations that stopped coming. Colleagues who spoke less freely around her. Moments of isolation that arrived without warning. She carried them quietly, understanding that nothing real ever changed without friction. One evening, she stood alone in the parking garage, the same level, the same space. The lights hummed. The concrete smelled faintly of oil and rain. She stood still, not reliving the moment, but acknowledging it. This place no longer owned her memory. She owned it. She drove home as the sun dipped low, the city washed in amber. At a stoplight, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. Older. Tired. Unmistakably steady. She thought of her father's words from years ago, about standing your ground, even when your legs shake. She smiled softly. At home, she cooked a simple dinner and ate at the counter, listening to the quiet tick of the clock. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Margaret, short and warm. Eleanor typed back and set the phone aside. The next morning, the courthouse filled again. Voices, footsteps, lives intersecting for reasons large and small. Eleanor took the bench, the seal behind her, the room rising as one. She waited until the movement settled before speaking. Her voice carried clear and even. She addressed the case before her, the people in front of her, the law as it stood and as it was meant to stand. In that moment, there was no garage, no cameras, no reports, only the work. And yet beneath it all, something had shifted. Not erased, not perfected, but opened. A crack wide enough for light. When the day ended, Eleanor gathered her things and paused at the door of her chambers. She looked once more at the room, then stepped out, locking it behind her, with a calm, deliberate turn of the key. Outside, the sky darkened into evening. The city moved, as cities always did, carrying stories forward, whether they were ready or not. Eleanor walked to her car, unhurried her posture, relaxed her path clear. This was not the end. It was not victory in the way stories liked to pretend. It was something quieter and stronger. continuation, attention, refusal to look away. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment your thoughts below using 3 simple words that matter to you.